Hi, everyone, and welcome to this workshop where we're going to be discussing cybersecurity assessments around the tagline, do you want to look good or do you actually want to be good? Before I get started, I'll present myself real quick. My name is Eric Rochette. I'm SVP of Global Services at GoSecure, where I handle three of our managed services, managed firewall, managed SIM, managed patching, as well as our advisory group and our pen testing group that participate in our assessment services and the cybersecurity assessments that we do. Also will mention that I have been part of the assessment world for several years, so this is a subject that is pretty close to home. So the objectives of this talk, we're going to discuss the realities behind cybersecurity assessments, audits, reviews. There's several names for these. So we're going to talk at a high level what these are, what they mean. We're going to talk about GoSecure's approach to this type of service, how we deliver value through this service, and how we feel we do it differently. And ultimately, what I want to do is clarify the service offering to help you, the client, select the project that aligns to your needs. There's several reasons why you would take this type of service, and we want to make sure that you understand sort of the underlying elements to this. What happens under the hood, and how does it align to the requirements that you have. So to get things started, we're going to talk about context. And what do we mean by looking good versus actually being good? And for that, we're going to take an example of a client that we've had in the last few years. This is not a client to be seen as a one-off. We run into this issue time and time again. But for the sake of this conversation, let's talk about a global organization, roughly 5,000 users. And this is not to mean that this doesn't apply to you if you're 100 users or 10,000 users. It does. Like I said, we run into this issue quite often. So the security team is working pretty hard to improve its cybersecurity posture, story that we hear pretty often. And in the past 3 years, this organization has been working with the same firm to measure its cybersecurity posture. And ultimately, in those 3 years, they've gone from a maturity of 2 to a maturity of 4. Now, if you need a reminder of what that maturity scale looks like, that is my next slide. But if you are aware of CMMI and the maturity scale used by a lot of assessors, you should know that going from a 2 to a 4 is a lot of effort in terms of the time that's spent to move up, and in terms of the budget that's spent to move up to a 4. Now, if we got back to our example, ultimately, we have a board of directors or management that's very happy. They've invested in improving, and the score shows improvement. So that's a good thing. So before we continue in the example, quick reminder of CMMI. So this is the model that results are provided in most assessments. It's based on CMMI somewhat, usually adapted in a certain sense by different service providers. But ultimately, it comes down to this usually, or something close to it. At level 1, your initial. So there's few controls and informal strategies. At level 2, you're developing these controls, you're developing these strategies. At level 3, you're defined. These controls are in place, strategies are formalized. That means they're documented as well. At level 4, quantitatively managed. These controls are established, like I mentioned, but they're also measurable. And at level 5, these controls are measurable. They output KPIs, and these KPIs can be used to improve over time. Ultimately, that's what you want to be at the highest level. Now, I will say 2 things about this model. One, not all organizations will necessarily be striving to be a level 5. It can happen over years as you move up sort of the scale and eventually want to head towards a 5, but it takes a lot of effort, a sizable team, sizable budget to get to that. Some organizations might actually want or accept to stay at defined. That's their target. That's where they want to get. And that's sort of in time. It can go up over the years, but it can be okay to say our target is a 3, and that's fine. So this doesn't need to be looked at in terms of percentages. A 3 doesn't mean 60%. And that's what I wanted to mention around that. So let's get back to our example of looking good versus being good. So that example of 5,000 users, they've gone up from a 2 to a 4 over the years. So like I said, this is a client of ours. We've had several discussions with them, but over time, we started discussing and understanding that, well, in the 3 years this firm has been doing assessments in the environment, firewall configurations were never validated. Architecture was never looked at. Find out that the network is flat. We find out that GPOs were never assessed. Telecom equipment was never looked at. Ultimately, and there were other items, but ultimately what that meant was that even though there was a great maturity score and significant investment to get to that, we don't have the trusted posture we would expect. And that's a problem because ultimately the board of directors might have a false sense of security. And what that means is the CISO or whoever's responsible for security might be in the hot seat if something were to happen. And ultimately, if you're at a 4 and you have invested a lot and you have a very mature posture, some of these fundamental things should not be still there. Now, what are the challenges with the type of this type of assessment work? First of all, I want to talk about managing expectations. The terms audit and assessment. These are used sometimes interchangeably by clients or others, but they don't mean the same thing. And we're going to talk about high-level definitions around these. And just to understand what we mean and what terms I'm going to be using here, at a high level, when we talk about audit, it implies more exhaustive validation. It talks about sampling from controls. It means compliance with different standards, whether it be ISO, NIST, or even internal standards. And ultimately, what it means is that it's a more extensive project. It requires significant internal involvement by the client because you ultimately want to look at controls. You want to know if you pass, you fail, it's a partial. You have to look at a lot of sets of data, and you have to gather evidence, usually. When you talk about assessments, that implies that it's non-exhaustive validation of controls. And it also implies that the depth and duration of the assessment depends on the methodology followed. I'm going to elaborate on this, but in other words, there's more flexibility for service providers in their approach. And what I mean by that, I'm going to explain a bit more in detail in this next slide here, where we're going to talk about interpreting standards. And we're going to take a very simple example around firewalls. But what do I mean about interpreting standards? Because standards are rarely explicit on the how. They're not very prescriptive. They don't say how to necessarily do things. So if we're going to take our simple example of firewalls, which is a technology that's somewhat fundamental to security in environments, everyone knows they should have a firewall. Well, if you think about the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001, well-known standards, you should know that the firewall word isn't even included in these documents. Again, they're high level, they are purposefully vague and non-prescriptive. When you talk about more control-oriented documents like ISO 27002, the word will be there, the word firewall will be there, but it's very, again, vague. It'll talk about, well, you want to put security on network services or you want to segregate your network, use something like a firewall or a router. So again, not prescriptive, doesn't say how it should be implemented and how it should be configured. And that's important to understand. When you just say that you want to comply to a standard, you have to understand there's a big gap between what that standard says and how it actually translates to real security. And that's sort of the point of this slide. And when you think about, well, this is the simple example with firewalls, how does that translate to remote access, to segmentation, to logical access? I think you start understanding the point here that it is pretty complex, sort of making sure that gap gets filled and that there's reduced or mitigated risk. So key considerations when you talk about sort of the expectations around this or what you expect when you get this type of service. One, do you actually want an audit or an assessment? That's important to sort of answer that question to make sure you align with what you're receiving as a proposal. Are you comfortable with the level of depth and accuracy of the audit or assessment? And here's a big one. Are you confident in your service provider's ability to interpret the standards? So the point I've been making in the last couple of slides. How much time do you need to invest internally? Again, if you're going to talk about an audit, you might have to invest a lot more time. And if you're talking about an assessment, maybe a little less. And finally, and this is not a joke, do you want to report on your apparent posture or the actual situation? We've run into a lot of clients that, for various reasons, whether it be timeline, whether it be promises to the board, whether it be just the situation or context of a certain organization, they want the report to be blank, to have to say everything is okay because they can't deal with the recommendations or deal with the actions that need to be taken if there are problems. So that is a possibility that we run into a lot. Obviously, that's not what we want. We want to provide reports that will help our organizations, our clients get better. But that is a real situation that we run into. So moving on, the CSA. This is Go Secure's Cybersecurity Assessment. And I'm going to provide a bit of insight on how we've built this over the year and what we've done to provide value and the type of assessment that we want to provide. So towards the end of 2017, we have an assessment. We're able to deliver on the actual state of the situation in an organization, and we're able to do that in a relatively short period of time. And this is for, let's say, a typical environment. Less than 3 months, we can get the proposal signed, meet up, interview with the client, analysis, provide a report, present. So fairly short time frame to get an actual view of what the cybersecurity posture is. That's something we had. That's something we wanted to keep. We also had a methodology that allowed us to ask for very low effort from our clients. We would interview in a very short time frame, a few hours. Then we would just gather a lot of configurations and documents that we can analyze offsite. That is something we had and we wanted to keep. What we wanted to improve on was, one, getting closer to standards. We wanted to have quantifiable results as opposed to qualitative results, and I'll elaborate on that in a couple of slides. And we wanted repeatable evaluation. What that means is we want a standardized methodology that doesn't rely entirely on the assessor or the analyst. So if I do an assessment 1 year and the next year my colleague does it, well, we have the same understanding of certain controls and certain components, and they're evaluated in the same way. That has to be standardized. Obviously, if we want to scale, that has to be in place. So let's talk about these things. Getting closer to standards. We already had a methodology that was aligned to ISO 27001, 20002, and we wanted to add a correlation to the NIST cybersecurity framework because we found it very interesting to provide visibility according to the 5 functions of NIST: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. That was somewhat simple to integrate, and we were able to present our results in the way you see them here in this slide. Where it got more complicated is quantifying our results. So shifting from qualitative to quantitative. What we had to do to be able to do this was to figure out what are the categories that we wanted to evaluate, and from that, the subcategories, and from that, the components. And to sort of illustrate that a bit, we're going to talk about here, for example, network architecture security. That would be at the category level. Segmentation and isolation would be a subcategory of that category. And then finally, we would have components of that subcategory in the form of ability to segment and isolate, segmentation strategy, isolation and implementation. And what we had to do is, once we've gotten down to the component level, is figure out how to score these things. What would be the recommended posture? Which ones are more important than others? And you can sort of see how that gets complicated. And to give you an idea of how much work that is, we have 20 categories, 50 subcategories, roughly 120 components, and we have started building into subcomponents. So that's a lot of work, one, to establish that sort of framework, but also to debate the value of these things internally. And that was done over time within the team, but it was a lot of work. So elaborating on that, or sort of summarizing on that, once we had those components, we had to figure out what their impact in regards to cybersecurity was. So we had to attribute weights to them because not every component had the same impact on cybersecurity, obviously. We also had to determine what that recommended posture was, which is not always that obvious because, as I mentioned, standards are not prescriptive. They don't say how. So that's research, that's going through vendor recommendations, etc. Again, a lot of work there. And ultimately, to quantify all of this, we had to establish an algorithm to sort of calculate how those component scores roll up to a subcategory score and roll up to a category score. So again, a lot of work spent on this part of the methodology. Finally, the repeatable evaluation portion. It became very clear early on in the process that we would need an application to manage all this, to adapt our methodology, conserve it. If there's an update like there was in the recent year of the NIST CSF 1.0 to 1.1, well, that has to be adapted in the methodology so that the analysts can work with that new framework. Obviously, there's advantages to this. It'll hold, as you see in the screenshot, links back to the various standards that we work with, and we can also obviously automate portions of the report production, which is a huge benefit. But that was an important element in developing all of this. What that gives ultimately, in just a quick report overview here, is we have on the left side our typical, let's say, recommendation where we see the risks, the observations of what we saw, the recommendations. We have it presented according to the 5 functions of NIST, and we also have references back to the standards to show that we're not just pulling this out of the air. This is mapped directly to standards, albeit I have mentioned that the standards are not that prescriptive and don't really say how, but it's still important to map to these known industry best practices. You also see in the middle here radar graphs, and you keep in mind that this is fully quantified in the back end, but you can see at a high level how you score in various categories, where that would be the red line. The blue line would be sort of that target score that you're looking for, target maturity that you're looking for, and the dotted line is your previous score. Again, if it's quantifiable and quantified, we can sort of map it very precisely on these types of graphs to show progress, which is really interesting to a lot of our clients. And finally, the roadmap aid on the right. These are the short-term, medium-term, longer-term projects that we feel should be prioritized according to risk that we see. We call it an aid because we assume that our clients have security programs that are already running. So we think this should be a complement to that. But if that is not the case, this can be sort of taken as is as a plan moving forward. Now, having spoken about the methodology, let's talk about our approach, because this is also something that is a bit different in the way we do things. Our approach to cybersecurity assessments is to go at it with 2 different teams with different skill sets, our advisory team and our ethical hacking team, our pen testing team. And it's to go with an approach that's top down, bottom up. What that means is that our advisory team is going to analyze things at the strategic level, understand what the approach is, interview the folks on the security team, understand how things are done, go through documentation and ultimately configurations. The pen testing team is going to do direct validation of technical controls in the environment. And from that, they can deduce if there's inadequate processes. Now, the advantage to all that, if I go to the next slide and we break down a typical CSA in the phases that you see here, is that you have, again, a more strategic phase and validation phases, which is testing, but it allows you to sort of conclude on strategic elements that are lacking with validation. I'll explain that. So typically our phases would include phase 1 here, cybersecurity governance assessment, which is more around the policies, processes, procedures, governance in place. Phase 2 is around infrastructure assessment. That is from the perimeter down to the endpoint, the solutions or security solutions that are in place, how are they deployed, how are they configured. Then comes the roadmap. That's pretty self-explanatory. And you have the validation phases in form of testing, external, internal, web app, and phishing campaigns. There's social engineering. Now, the advantage to having this top-down, bottom-up approach is that if you take something somewhat simple, let's talk about patch management. At the governance level, you might have a proper strategy in place, patch all the systems, patch them monthly. At the infrastructure level, so phase 2, you may or may not have the right tools for that. If you say, for example, that you have WSUS, well, that might be an indicator of a gap because WSUS is not all that great at patching non-Microsoft systems and not all that great at patching third-party applications. Say an organization, however, does have the right process at phase one and have the right tool at phase two. Well, the advantage of testing is that we're going to validate in the environment our patches are actually deployed throughout in the right way. So you might be patching some subnets appropriately and others maybe just forgotten or not done, knowingly or unknowingly. And that's sort of the value of having that approach from a different perspective, is that you can conclude that, hey, the strategy is good, but it's not actually applied all that well, or the strategy is not that good, and here's the proof. So what this allows us to do from another sense in terms of the approach is variable scoping. So we've built our methodology, as I've explained, and having done all the work in terms of category, subcategory, and components, it allows us to scope in and out very dynamically to customize for our clients. So at the full CSA level, you see all the categories on the left. You see the first column that sort of covers everything. But with the methodology and the tool that we have in place, we're also able to provide very customized and variable scoping. One of these examples is the CSA Essentials that you see in the lighter red here. The ask from a lot of our clients over time has been, can you do something with a lesser scope, smaller budget? And it was always difficult for us to do that because what do you scope in and what do you leave out? Ultimately, the answer we came up with was to align to the Verizon DBIR report and figure out per industry what are the most risky areas and to include that in the scope. So whether you're in education or finance, well, we're going to look at the specific controls that apply to you, which are the key risk areas for that industry, and that's what we're going to scope in. And we were able to do that fairly quickly with the methodology we have. But it also translates to things like backup security, logical access, to incident readiness. These are all types of assessments that we can create, not necessarily on the fly, but very quickly because of the way we've input all the information into our application and our methodology. So what's next with all that? We have on the roadmap. What we want to do very quickly is to include all of this into a web portal to provide our results as an interactive view of the organization's security. So when you get our report, it's not only a report form, but also sort of dynamically presented in a portal. And what that means as well is we want to be able to provide dynamic grouping. The CSA covers wide and a lot of categories, but we want to be able to provide our clients with views on, well, even though we covered wide, what is, for example, from a client perspective, what is my perspective or what is my posture in terms of backup security? What is my posture in terms of remote access security, and sort of bring up that information that we already have and just package it differently in different views. So that's something that I think will be very interesting for a lot of our clients. We also want to add to the quantitative risk-based analysis. We want to leverage empirical data a lot more. So I've talked about the internal debates on what is more valuable to security, what is not. In terms of component scoring, that the debate within the team. What we can do is leverage empirical data, such as the Verizon DBIR report, a lot more to sort of align and bolster the expertise that we have within the team with other data that's out there. And that's something that we're going to be working on to, again, solidify our view in terms of risk in what we see in environments. Finally, we want to improve this as a decision-making tool. We want to quantitatively understand security risk and want to provide data such as annual loss expectancy data to decision makers in our clients' environments. We also want to be able to predict security posture based on potential changes and initiative. If we are able to quantify things, we can also quantify what a score will be based on certain activities or certain projects that are applied or put in place over time. And ultimately, that'll ensure ROI. And it also helps enhance business planning, meaning that the roadmaps can be more accurate and you have better decisions on what you should proceed on based on decisions that are made. So, lessons learned. So, I'm going to be wrapping up here. What did we learn throughout this whole sort of process? That's not finished, but a lot of work has been put in already. So, I think we can conclude already on some of the things that we've gone through. Developing a methodology that's effective, quantifiable, and delivers realistic assessments is not easy. Like I mentioned, it's been many hours, a lot of work, some surprises, a lot of debate, but it really is a complicated task, and you need a significant team with expertise to be able to produce this. The CSA methodology is a product of our expertise, but it doesn't replace experts. I think this is an important one to mention. We, in no way, shape, or form do I think by creating this methodology that we can just hire an army of juniors and do cybersecurity assessments. There's too much importance on context and understanding how organizations work to be able to just, hand this out as a tool where you can easily do assessments. It's just not realistic to think that way. Finally, not all cybersecurity assessments are created equal. We've seen all kinds of things out there. We've seen vulnerability scans be called security assessments. We've seen security assessments that sort of just pick and choose a couple of domains, and that doesn't provide full coverage, meaning that certain organizations might think they're good, but their very important category is completely scoped out. So, and others that we've seen are just assessments on clients' good intentions, which is just the documentation, but not seeing how that actually translates to reality. It's important to have a good understanding of what sort of the global view is and what type of assessment you're getting. Again, otherwise you can be sort of led in the wrong way. So in closing, to wrap things up here, I'm going to cover just a couple of things that I mentioned just to make sure that these are all clear. I want to highlight again that audit doesn't equal assessment. And, this is, the keep in mind the idea that the exhaustive versus non-exhaustive. And when you talk assessment, that sort of flexibility that service providers have, very important. Compliance does not equal security. This is not to say that compliance does not have its value. It absolutely does, but it doesn't automatically equate to better security. You have to understand that because, again, standards are vague. They don't translate all that well to how you need to do things in the environment. And finally, looking good doesn't equal to being good. And hopefully with sort of the view a bit under the hood on the methodology we've been working on and the various points that I explained today, that will be more and more clear to all of you. So that's it for me. I want to thank you for listening, and I will be available at the roundtable for discussion in a few moments. Thank you very much.